Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of Hammer Time. We have been on a hiatus for quite a while, but the US election made it absolutely necessary to restart the podcast. And as always, I'll try to produce more content in the weeks to come because we are entering a new era. Many of you believed it. I have to admit, I had my doubts, but as it turned out, Donald Trump did it. He will be not just the 45th, but also the 47th president of the United States. Numbers are still coming in, but it's very unlikely that his victory can be taken away from him anymore. And in the coming weeks and coming months, until the official inauguration on January 20th, 2021, we have to look at what this means. I think a few breakdowns are important of what Donald Trump has accomplished and what we have to look forward to in the future. One is what delivered the election to Donald Trump was not just the turnout in rural areas, but it was also what I would call the Frederick Douglass vote. That's a term I really hope that is going to catch on. And what I mean by this is that African Americans and other minorities came out significantly stronger, still not a majority, but came out significantly stronger for Donald Trump than they did in previous elections for Republican candidates. This will turn out probably to be a better result than the one that Richard Nixon had. So this is going to be a huge success for the Republicans who, under Donald Trump, have begun to build a multi-ethnic working class coalition that is held together by a sincere belief in the possible greatness of the United States, in patriotism, in an idealistic nationalism that crosses ethnic lines, that crosses religious lines, that is the glue that holds America together as a nation. So I think this was indeed, my sympathies are well known, but I think this indeed was a victory for the United States. What is also important to say is that states that trended red, particularly what was once known as the blue wall, is increasingly looking like a red wall. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, just like Ohio and Florida in the past, these states seem to become solidly red states. I think that's very good news as well. It also looks as if Trump is going to have a majority in Congress. And this is going to be important because the question will be, will he make the same mistake that he made in 2016? Which means that the Republican establishment will force politicians on him that then pursue the same status quo politics that so many Americans justifiably have hated? Or will he actually have a transition team, and signs are very good at the moment, that will allow a new kinds of politics? Because contrary to what the media has been telling you, Donald Trump did not win this election because he's a fascist. Donald Trump did not win this election because he wants to turn the United States into a dictatorship. Donald Trump did win this election because people are fed up with the status quo. That's true in the United States, but it's also true in Europe. I don't know if any of you owns a boat, but I think there is a nice comparison for this. The state of politics, the ship of politics, again, I think this is true both in the United States and in Europe. It's like a ship that is full of barnacles, right? And what barnacles do to a ship is, at the same time, it's much harder to keep it on course, but it burns more and more fuel even though it gets slower. And I think this is what we see happening all over the West, right? Maintaining the status quo costs more and more money, needs more and more taxes, needs more and more bureaucracy. And it's, I think, no coincidence that the word barnacle starts with a B and the word bureaucracy starts with a B. So this is getting more and more, and the ship is getting slower and slower and slower and is dragged down. And if Donald Trump can live up to his promise that he will use people like Elon Musk, who are supposed to be cleansers of this body politic, this ship, that they will turn away, that they will, break off those barnacles, that the American ship cannot just move more freely, but also at lower cost, at more efficiency. I think this would be a huge success. And the American democracy in the past has so often shown a tremendous capacity for renewal, for revitalization. And I think this is something we might also see this time, or at least this is something that I'm hoping for. What we also have to say is, it's not just a great American success story. It is also a story that shows us something that has happened in America before. Just as a quick example, during the time of Andrew Jackson, right? The American government was actually to say it mildly, having serious issues with corruption, or as it is euphemistically called in history books, with the so-called spoils system. And it took the assassination of President Garfield that the so-called Pendleton Act was executed, which was the idea that bureaucrats, that civil servants, they have to be chosen by merit, that not just by whom they know and what kind of connections they have to the establishment, to the party establishment. And I think what we see now with Trump is a move in the same direction, that he can be either officially by law or just by the policies that he's going to execute, that he can be a renewal of this Pendleton Act, to say, okay, there are serious problems the United States have, and in the past we have outsourced too many decisions, too many important acts to unnamed bureaucrats, three-letter institutions, the EPA, the OSHA, and all these mysterious institutions that have gathered more and more power over time, but are not really accountable to anybody. A very similar situation, again, as the one that we have in Europe, right, where more and more power is given to institutions, and that they are no longer accountable to the voters. So contrary to what, for example, the founding fathers believed, that that every politician is so ambitious, they want to have more and more power for themselves. Very often what politicians really want to do is to be in office, and of course also be well paid for it, but try not to change as much as possible, right? To keep it steady. This is, I think, very important, because when we talk about the establishment, the elite, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is it's those who want to maintain the status quo, right? As I said, it's like the barnacles on a ship. They have no interest in making things more efficient, faster, better working. They just want to keep things as they are. And this is the purpose for which they accumulate power. Donald Trump, I believe, is somewhat different, right? That he really wants to do things differently, which is why he did invite people already into his transition team and administration, like Elon Musk, like Robert F. Kennedy, like Tulsi Gabbard, right? All people that really want to change the direction of the United States. Now, this is not going to be easy. I think as much as we enjoy the outcome of the election, as much as we can also hope that there will be a solid majority in Congress, the bureaucracy, again, just like in Europe, has a will on its own. So some people call it the deep state, and I'm fine with that expression. But what it is are bureaucrats who want to maintain their position, they want to maintain their agencies, and they will fight tooth and nail to keep these things in place. They will use the courts, they will use their influence, they will use their lobby groups, they will use parts of the Republican Party. So this really is going to be an uphill battle. Now, for the moment, it's time to celebrate, right? This was a victory, as I said, many of you expected it. This is a victory for some of us, including myself, that was not expected, but it happened nonetheless. Congratulations to those of you who had more trust and were more optimistic about the outcome of this election. And I've never been so happy about being wrong in my life. So this was definitely a good outcome. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind about this is now it is time to work. I think the challenges, the obstacles that Donald Trump has to overcome are quite substantial. As always, we have to separate the rhetoric from what is possible. Will he end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours? Probably not. But will he have to put forward a plan how to end the war as quickly and as efficiently as possible? I think absolutely. I think the issues that he was addressing via Robert F. Kennedy, right, that the American health condition is absolutely problematic. Making America healthy again, I think, is an absolutely crucial idea. And it goes beyond something that Mr. Kennedy has spoken about, the use, for example, of psychopharmaca, the obesity, diabetes. It is also psychological health, right? Particularly young men, which came out, as it seems at the moment, significantly for Trump, right? We need to find ways again for these young men to channel their energy into productive activities. And this has to start early on, right? Whether it's joining, certain clubs, sports clubs, the military, right? I think the fitness level of the military needs to be increased. In the last couple of years, instead of making sure that people who want to join the military have to reach a certain standard, standards has been lowered. And still the American military is not meeting its recruited numbers. I believe another challenge in foreign policy will be to hold the Europeans to account. Because the Europeans, again, just like the barnacles on a ship, they were believing if Kamala Harris wins, then they can lean back and make themselves comfortable in the status quo. That is no longer going to work, right? Now there is a new old occupant of the White House, and he has to hold Europeans to account. The Europeans need to start take care of themselves, right? In cooperation with the United States, I hope, this is something I want to say here, I hope that Donald Trump will push for a free trade agreement. I think that Europeans, Germans particularly, need to be broken out of the dependency they have created on China. I think they have to be healed, if I can use that expression, from the suicidal policies, both in the realm of economics and in the realm of migration. And the same, of course, is true in the United States as well. What this election has shown, that with a policy, an announcement that is critical of mass migration, illegal mass migration in particular, you can win minority votes. The big lie, if I want to use that expression, that you have been told by the media so often is that there is like white America on one side and then there is minority America on the other side. And all these who are part of the minority America, they want more migration, they want mass migration, they want amnesty, they want all these things. It is not true, because very often they are the ones who suffer the most. Angus Deaton, himself one of the best economists that ever lived, made this very interesting observation that is that, for example, one of the best things that happened to Black America was after the Civil War, when mass migration, as it was at the time, from China was stopped, right? And when it was harder to immigrate also from Europe to the United States, because these forced employers in the United States to hire Black Americans who did an excellent job and then started to rise economically. And the same is true now. The United States must, first of all, pursue a policy, the same is true in Europe, to get rid of those who are in the country illegally, and particularly those who have committed crimes, and then they must digest those who are there. And there can be ideas. I think if it is done in a just way, I think there can be good ways to find a potential path of citizenship for those who are there illegally. But of course, by the same token, you have to prefer those and treat them better who came to the United States legally. So it is not fair, and I'm sure that many of you made that experience yourself, that somebody applies for a green card, needs to hire a lawyer, has to wait for 4 years to get a green card, and somebody who crossed over into the United States illegally is then put in front of the line, right? I think also within the migrant community, a certain form of justice has to be enacted. But all of this is possible. So I think that Donald Trump now does have a mandate to really make significant changes to how the United States pursue its future. And another thing is important, because they already hear from the left, is this going to be the end of the United States? Will Donald Trump become a dictator? Whatever it is, this is not going to happen. The US Constitution, the US political system is designed in a way to precisely limit, if you will, a politician like Donald Trump, somebody who's very ambitious, who really wants to make vast changes. He will run up against the courts. He will run up against members of his administration. So the fear that he will install himself as a dictator, I think, is completely overwrought. This is not going to happen. The danger was always greater with the Democratic Party, because they did not so much have the desire to crown a potential queen or to crown a potential dictator. For them, the path to power was always via the institutions, right? If you control the bureaucracy, it doesn't matter who's in charge. I always like to quote Mark Stein on my show because I think it's such a great quote. There's a difference between being in office and being in power. And this is going to be the fourth big challenge for Trump. He needs to clean out the bureaucracy. I'm sure you have heard during the campaign that the horrific Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. But if you ever have the time to take a look at those 900 pages, this is basically what they are suggesting. And I think they're right in that suggestion. If you want the president to be successful within the executive branch of government, he needs a bureaucracy that follows his orders. Not because he's a dictator, but this is actually the constitutional order. What happened in the first Trump administration was that very often his own bureaucracy acted against him. And this, of course, has to stop. And if this means firing people, right, if this means replacing people who have the same worldview as Trump, that doesn't mean that they have to be sycophants. That doesn't mean that these are people that treat Trump like a cult leader. But it means that people that share his worldview, right? There are people like Mike Pompeo, like Elbridge Colby, right? There are very good individuals who would be perfectly suited to staff a new Trump administration. But this is very crucial, because otherwise you end up with 4 years of Trump as the head of ship, if you want, but nothing is going to change, right? The barnacles will still stick around. The ship will still get slower. The ship will still be on the wrong course. And I think that's absolutely crucial. We know another one of these idiosyncrasies of the American system that is very hard for us Europeans to understand. So it will now take until January 20th for Donald Trump to be actually in office. But I think he can already make the first steps, right? He can lay out like a detailed transition to him. And he can make sure, as we just said, that there will be not just a change of who is in office, but that there actually will be a change of who is going to be in power. And that means, in many ways, right? Hiring new people and letting other people go. Now, as a quick note also, what does this mean for Europe? Because the conditions now are different than the conditions were in 2016 when Donald Trump became the president the first time. These are very good news for the right-of-center parties in Europe. And this has to be yet another strategy, I believe, of the new Trump administration. Right? They have to reach out to those parties, to those politicians who openly supported a second Trump term, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, whether it's Giorgia Meloni in Italy, whether it's members of the AfD in Germany, whether it's Le Pen in France, whether it's part of the Reform Party in the UK. There are many people in Europe, both on the political level, but also on the popular level, right, who were very much in favor of Donald Trump, and he must overrule, very often, I believe, his own State Department, who are still in favor of the old barnacle elite also in Europe. And this is something that's very important. Trump must find now, not just domestically, he must find allies internationally to cooperate with. This will, of course, also mean that, again, many decisions probably have to be made also in Europe that not initially will be popular with the population, but that will be necessary. He has to keep Europeans to account for their idiotic energy policies, right? He has to explain to Europeans, both in public and in private, that yes, Europe should consider fracking, should consider the extraction of shale oil and shale gas, that a return to nuclear power is necessary, that uranium is not supposed to come from Russia but from Australia or Canada or any other potential ally, that Europe needs to take more responsibility about what's happening in Africa, what's happening in the Middle East, that there must be a burden sharing between what the United States do in the Indo-Pacific and what the Europeans can do in their own backyard. So a lot of these things will not be popular with Europe at the beginning, but I think on the long run, these are the things that will be necessary and that will ultimately, potentially, not just lead to a renaissance in the United States, but also to a renaissance in Europe. There's this misunderstanding that exists in Europe is that, as I said before, you can just continue the way in which things have been done in the past, but that is no longer going to work. Everybody needs to adapt and say, we are at a crossroads. The decision was, and this is why I was so pessimistic for so many people, whether they choose decline or renewal. It appears as if there is a real shot at the Europeans and the Americans and Western civilization as a whole to choose renewal. But that means, of course, that the work needs to be done. This is not going to be easy. I just want to tell you a few numbers. Right? Europeans take too many vacation days. Right? Europeans retire too early. European schools and universities, a problem they also have in the United States, are no longer world-class. The energy prices are too high. Again, migration policy, we've talked about this a lot on this show, but many, many reforms have to be done that I believe, at least in the short term, will be painful, even for those who are for this kind of renewal. So this is something that has to be clearly said. This is not going to be easy, as it will not be easy in the United States. But I think that the willingness to make this shift is there. And this is something that you and I, in our functions, as participants in the public discourse, as participants in the podcast sphere, whatever you want to call it, that we also have to do. We need also to hold the Trump administration to account. We need to hold the European governments to account, because now really is a chance for not a revolution, which I think would potentially have been the way forward in the worst case scenario if the elections both in Europe and the United States would not have ended the way they did. Now we have the chance for renewal and a renaissance. And I'll promise that I will also try to make my contribution by providing you, and I'm very grateful for those who kept faith with my podcast for such a long time, to providing you with more content in the future. But I think today we can be very optimistic about what's possible in the future. As I said before, the work begins now. The work begins in a couple of months, and let's embark on this path together. And I'm looking forward to, again, doing much more with you guys in the future. Thank you very much.